the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, a surprise and unstoppable military offensive began by the Imperial Japanese Navy, with the aim of remaining in control of the Pacific Ocean. Thus, one of the main scenarios of the Second World War began to unfold. Of course, the Japanese were not satisfied with this alone. They immediately seized control of the Philippines, Singapore, the Dutch East Indies, Wake Island, New Britain Island, the Gilbert Islands, and Guam, all territories that victory after victory were conquered by devastating the Allied forces. But what was the next target? In April 1942, after ruling out a complete invasion of the territory, Japan set out to isolate Australia and New Zealand from the United States. For this, the occupation of the small island of Tulagi, southeast of the Solomon Islands, and Port Moresby, the capital of Papua New Guinea, were fundamental in what was called Operation Mo. The latter was a key city for supplying the Allies in the region. Thus, all of northern Australia would come under the influence of the Japanese Air Force, and the Empire would expand its perimeter, endangering then the rest of Australia. What the Japanese did not know was that for some time, the United States and Great Britain had been deciphering part of their secret communications, with which they could anticipate the attacks and intercept the Japanese Navy. The confrontation finally took place in an area called the Coral Sea between May 4th and 8th, 1942, a battle that would go down in history as the first air-naval confrontation, the first in which the aircraft carriers were the main protagonists, and above all, the battle that saved Australia from Japanese conquest. But do you want to know more about how the Battle of the Coral Sea unfolded and the magnitude of the forces that faced each other? We'll tell you the answer to this question and several others in the next few minutes. So make yourself comfortable and prepare to travel back in time. Gordon Johnson, an Australian soldier who fought there in those years, declared in 2014, "The Battle of the Coral Sea is not getting the level of recognition it deserves. It was as important as the Battle of Kokoda or the Battle of Gallipoli, and it prevented the Japanese from invading Port Moresby by sea." Therefore, to better understand the importance of the battle, let's first analyze how the forces that faced each other were made up. Basically, there were 4 large groups of boats whose prominence varied throughout the 4 days of combat. A clash in which, curiously, the ships did not fight at any time, but the embarked planes did. For this reason, the aircraft carriers received all of the attention. The first group consisted of the Japanese invasion force and 2 other support convoys, namely the light aircraft carrier Shoho and a series of cruisers to protect it. The second group, Allied Task Force 44, consisted of several U.S. vessels and the only 2 Australian vessels that participated, the cruisers HMAS Australia and HMAS Hobart. This force was in charge of finding and attacking the Japanese invasion force. The third group was a second Allied force, perhaps the most powerful one, made up of the 2 Allied aircraft carriers, the USS Lexington and the USS Yorktown, as well as a dozen cruisers and destroyers as defense. Their mission? Getting rid of their Japanese air-naval counterparts and stop the invasion. And the fourth group, of course, was the Japanese Carrier Strike Force, with its 2 great protagonists, the carriers Zuikaku and Shokaku, along with their destroyers and protective cruisers. In total, the Allies had 2 aircraft carriers that combined about 128 aircraft, 8 cruisers, 14 destroyers, and 2 oil tankers. On the Japanese side, 3 carriers that combined about 140 aircraft, 9 cruisers, 15 destroyers, 2 minesweepers, 2 miners, 2 submarine fighters, 3 gunboats, 1 oil tanker, 1 seaplane tender, and 12 transports with approximately 5,000 soldiers on board. As for the combat itself, the bulk of the battle began on the morning of May 7th, after several days of strategic moves, deception, and mistakes on both sides. It should be noted that, having been the first air-naval battle, neither the Americans nor the Japanese had any experience to draw on. In fact, several of the aerial sightings by the bombers were misreported, and thus there was a lot of confusion at first. The truth is that after the Japanese sunk the destroyer Sims and the oil tanker Neosho, both belonging to the US, at 11:15, the air group on aircraft carriers USS Lexington and USS Yorktown successfully bombed the Japanese carrier Shoho, sinking just 20 minutes later. The Americans only lost 3 aircraft, while the Japanese lost 18. In the afternoon, even with severe accidental misinformation involved, the battle continued in the air. The F-4F Wildcat fighters were sent to intercept the different types of Japanese bombers, such as the Nakajima B-5N, the Mitsubishi G-4M, or even the Japanese dive bombers, the Aichi D-3A. For their part, the Mitsubishi A-5M and A-6M Zero fighters did the same against North American bombers, such as, for example, the Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers or the Douglas TBD Devastator. At night, there were even Japanese aircraft that confused their carriers and almost landed on enemy vessels, realizing their mistake upon being welcomed by anti-aircraft artillery. It was in this regard that, in 1972, U.S. Vice Admiral H.S. Duckworth said, "Without a doubt, on May 7, 1942, the Coral Sea area was the most confusing air battle in world history." The dawn of May 8th would bring a new day of battle, beginning shortly after 6 a.m. At around 11 a.m., all the carriers were in close proximity, leading to fierce air combat that ended with the withdrawal of the Japanese carrier Shokaku and the loss of several aircraft on both sides. Around the same time, the 2 U.S. aircraft carriers were the target of successful bombardments, although they managed to resist. By 2:30 p.m., the combat had ended and the damage recording began. Both sides had concerns about low fuel levels and not knowing the number of aircraft available to the enemy. Therefore, the Japanese decided to give up their invasion attempt. Meanwhile, on the North American side, explosions began to occur on the USS Lexington due to the serious damage received in combat. The ship finally sank at 7:52 p.m. after 5 hours of agony. The most curious thing about all this was that both sides considered themselves victorious. Japan, because it caused a greater number of casualties to its adversary, and the United States, because it managed to prevent the Japanese from invading Australia. In fact, it was the first time that an Allied fleet was able to stop the Japanese advance in the Pacific, something that, sometime later, would prove to be a fundamental strategic victory in the course of the war. And now, coming to the end of this video, it's time for you to join the debate and answer this question. What do you think would have happened in the Pacific War if Japan managed to prevail in the Battle of the Coral Sea and invade Australia? Leave us your comment below. And don't forget to subscribe and activate notifications to learn about many more military events that left their mark on history. Thank you very much for joining us, and until the next video.